Professor Tobias Straumann, thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
I'm curious to know some more about your background. So I read your book 1931, which was fascinating, and reached out to you after that. But I know you're a professor at the University of Zurich as well. So I'm curious, what compelled you to study economic and monetary history?
Well, I started out as a normal historian, just interested in how we have gotten here where we are. And after my PhD, I was a teacher and journalist. I went abroad. And then after 5 years, I came back to the university because I realized that economics is really important. And I kind of restarted my whole career by going to an American university and coming back and writing a second thesis. And then, yes, that was then the prelude to the professorship.
Hmm. And then what was the inspiration, or why did you decide to write the book 1931, Debt Crisis and the Rise of Hitler?
Well, I've been working on the interwar years for about more than 20 years. So it's my favorite time period because you can learn so much from that. Many things did not go well, so you can learn from that. And so that was one reason I had been teaching the German crisis for several years also. And then I realized that after the Euro crisis, lasted about from 2010 to 2012, people did not really understand the mechanism, and it reminded a lot of what happened in the interwar years. Of course, it was not the same thing, but there were similar structures. And then I decided to kind of turn my speeches into a book to remind the people that the crisis may have started in 1929, but the crucial turning point to the worst was in 1931. And so that's why I chose the title. I wanted to tell the people that there happened something really important between 1929 and 1933 when Hitler came to power, or when the Great Depression in the US started to end after the Roosevelt administration took office.
Mm-hmm. How how has your book been received, like, on both sides, positive and negative? What do people think about its analysis?
I think most people have found it interesting to read because the style is very accessible, and
Hmm.
most people didn't know about 1931 apart
Yeah.
from the specialists. And it's a trade book. It's really for the broader public who is interested in major events of financial and monetary history. So really bad reviews I've never gotten, but the German economic historians have found a lot of, let's say, minor mistakes maybe.
Oh,
And
really?
yeah, sure, they always know it much better than the rest of the world.
What's an example of a minor mistake some German historians have found?
Yeah, it's about the banking crisis. I mean, I think in the Anglo-Saxon world, we rather talk of a triplet crisis. It was a banking crisis, a debt crisis, and a currency crisis. And you can argue
Hmm.
about the causality between the three crises, but I mean, it's a very interesting debate. But in the end, maybe nobody knows exactly the answer. But the Germans always think it was a banking crisis, and I think that's not. It was more than that.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to go back to leading up to 1931 in Germany. What's happening around the world? So, I mean, I think we should probably start. Correct me if I'm wrong. With the end of World War One and Treaty of Versailles. What was expected of Germany in that agreement?
Yeah, well, you're right. You have to start with the end of World War One because that's the aftermath of the war was so difficult and challenging that was kind of foreseeable that they would fail. Not because they were not very able politicians. Maybe they were, but it was really very, very difficult to establish a stable order politically and economically. Um, well, the problem was that the United States was not interested in cutting their debt claims towards France and Great Britain. That was the beginning. So the Republicans mostly, but also the Democrats, I think there was a bipartisan consensus, thought that it was for domestic political reasons impossible to tell the American public that they would have to, cut some of their claims, because in the end, the U.S. did not go voluntarily into the war and wanted to come back after the war. So that was kind of the biggest problem. So France and Great Britain were heavily indebted towards the United States, but also towards their own people. So they decided to impose a rather huge reparation bill on Germany, because and that's understandable, because they were not in a very strong position either. That was kind of the starting point. But it's important to remember that they always tried to readjust the whole payment schedule. They were quite tolerant. It was not that Germany was crushed by reparations. That's a wrong story. But still, it was not a realistic strategy. Maybe less for financial reasons, but for political reasons. But because the German people did not accept it, then they tried to reform it at least twice. It was the famous Dawes Plan, exactly 100 years ago in 1924, and then the Young Plan 5-6 years later. So it's not a story that the Allies crushed Germany, but still it was not it just didn't work. It was not a very good solution to the reparation problem either.
So what didn't work specifically? Were they incapable of paying off the amount of debt they were supposed to, or how
Not
do you
really.
analyze that part?
Probably if they had wanted to pay the Germans, they could have. There is a paper by two friends of mine from Germany who calculated that if the Germans had not rearmed, they would have been able to pay this yearly this annuity. So it was not a huge bill, but one of the biggest problems was that the final sum was public, and that was an enormous amount of reparations. The yearly payment were more or less okay,
Okay.
but the final amount, and that was politically not very 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 smart to have a really huge bill, and then on the other hand you try to compensate by keeping it low on an annual basis. And I think that was the main reason. And of course, the other reason we learn in school is that the German people did not really accept the defeat, because the war had never been within Germany. So they thought, or at least the general, the army and its staff, Hindenburg and Ludendorff, they started to tell the people that it had been the Social Democrats who were hindering the army to fulfill its task. And of course, that was a big lie, but it kind of got traction within a certain share of the German population. And I think there is a certain consensus among historians. It was really because the war did not go across the German border. That was completely different during the Second World War, and especially after the Second World War, when Germany was occupied by the Allies, both in the West and in the East.
Hmm. What else? Take us through what else was happening economically around the world leading up to 1931. So I know there was hyperinflation in Germany in the early 20s, right?
Exactly.
There's the 1929 crash in the U.S., like you had mentioned. There's the Young Plan in there. What's going on around the world economically at that time?
Yeah, that's very important to remember that the war officially ended in Europe or in most parts of Europe in 1918. But I think the real end was not there until 1923 because of hyperinflation, civil war, attempted revolutions, or think of Italy. I mean, Mussolini took power in 1922, so that was during the same very, very turbulent period. And only about 1923-24, we have a turning point. Most parts of Europe, even in Russia, the Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, they can consolidate their power on around 22-23 after a very brutal civil war. And then is kind of the good period, the golden 20s. You have
Hmm.
the recovery from the war starts in 1924 across Europe, also in the United States, but it lasts only 4 to 5 years. So the golden 20s is actually just half of the 20s. But that's kind of a good period. But it was, for Germany, it was built on additional private debt, especially in the sense that the government um, took loans from especially American banks. So there were private creditors, not
Hmm.
the reparation debt. And at the end of this golden 20s, the combined debt, the combined foreign debt of the Weimar Republic, reparations, so towards Great Britain and France, and on the other hand, towards foreign banks, mostly US, was almost 100% of GDP. And that's enormous because that was denominated in gold or dollar or foreign currencies. So
Hmm.
you were really in a straitjacket. So these golden 20s were not really very golden for Germany. They were built on a very rapidly increasing foreign debt burden.
Wow. So then let's move to 1931 itself. What was happening in Weimar Germany at that time?
Well, the recession starts earlier in Germany. It starts already in late 1928, especially in the industry. So that shows that the economy of the Weimar Republic was not very robust
Hmm.
already before the stock market crash in the United States occurred in October of 1929. So it starts early, and from this moment on, from the moment the recession starts in Germany, the government is in a very difficult situation, and that's not specific to Germany in the 30s. You can observe it everywhere. I was witnessing it during the Euro crisis, for example, in Greece. So they had a lot of foreign debt. It was
Hmm.
denominated in euro, so it was not not really dollar or another or gold, but the euro was, of course, that was an external currency for
Yeah.
Greece. They could not manipulate it. So that was exactly the same situation. And when a government has a huge share of foreign debt denominated in a foreign currency, what it has to do during a recession, it has to achieve a budget surplus because you need the transfers, you need the surplus to transfer, but you also need, and that makes it even harder, a trade surplus because you need a surplus of foreign currencies because you have
Hmm.
to,
Yeah.
convert uh, the budget surplus into foreign currencies to transfer uh, well, the debt or the servicing, you would fulfill the conditions of debt service. And that's absolutely brutal because your economy is tanking. And
Yeah.
then on top of that, you have a really austerity and you have no choice if you're not if you're not cutting wages and increasing um, taxes and all that, you're not going to be able to service this debt. And of course, that's a very very difficult and very dangerous situation, and especially politically dangerous because, and I think that's maybe the main point of my book. It's very
Hmm.
easy for the opposition to blame you for all the misery if you
Yeah.
can tell them we have a lot of unemployed people, but the priority of the government are the foreign creditors. And then, of course, you can, from a Nazi perspective, you can combine this with anti-Semitic stereotypes. That makes it even more poisonous. But I think the first part of the argument was, even at that time, the central argument of the Nazis. They said this is not possible. This is an offense to our unemployed, and we need to get out of this whole international treaty system. And the government was thinking, no, we're going to stick to that until the creditors realize that this is not a very good policy. But that was not a very good strategy in the end.
Mm. So this led up to a very specific financial crisis in July of 1931. Is that right?
Yeah, it starts a little bit earlier, but it's the summer of 1931, right?
And
Exactly.
so how did that play out? What was happening with the banks and the
Yeah,
economy at that exact point?
yeah. Well, it was just a catastrophe to happen because, as I said, it was a structural problem. There was a straitjacket that
Hmm.
ruined both economics and the politics of the Weimar Republic. And it actually started when the then Chancellor Heinrich Brüning announced when going forward with another round of austerity measures and tax increases, he announced that that was kind of the last time we do that, because the German people would not accept another round of austerity measures. And the signal to the investors, of course, or especially to foreign investors, was okay, they're about to stop paying reparations. And we're
Hmm.
going to see a financial crisis or a bankruptcy or a debt event, however you want to call it. And of course, then you have this typical self-fulfilling prophecy when foreign investors withdraw their short-term loans then or deposits, then it's over. And first, of course, you saw it with the banks. Then you had pressure on the currency because everybody was leaving the German mark. So you had that, and and then in the mid of July, the first German bank had to close its doors, and then you needed, and then the German government also suspended the gold standard by introducing capital controls. So that was one of the most important uh, feature of the gold standard, that it was fully convertible gold and banknotes across the border, not just within the country. And that was it. So it's this triplet crisis: currency, banking, uh, and debt. And then they tried to save the situation. The U.S. government, it was the Hoover administration, tried to save the situation by introducing a moratorium of all war-related debts for a year, but it didn't work because the French government was not did not accept the deal in the beginning, but and then after a few weeks they finally accepted, but it was too late. Confidence could not be restored. And I think what's really important for people to know, it was just not the stock market crash of 1929. It was this German crisis. Germany was the biggest economy in Europe, and it had enormous repercussions. It kind of ruined the liberal financial and monetary system in Europe. It led to the devaluation of the pound sterling. It led to a run on the dollar and another banking crisis
Hmm.
in the US, and it turned the worldwide recession into a depression. So it was after 1931, people are really desperate. They thought it's over with capitalism; it's never going to
Hmm.
recover. So, so it's not just a German crisis, and I think that the Germans themselves sometimes underestimate what the German crisis really is. It's really the turning point of the Great Depression. Even in the United States, it was a major event.
So how does that tie in then? And I know you explained some of it there, but so England and ended their gold standard around the same time, right? Their peg to gold, and the U.S. stopped convertibility uh, or seized gold, right? Actually, in 1933, I think. So a few years
Yes.
later. How does that all? How do those events tie in to this?
Yeah, the link from Germany to the city of London was through several channels, but the most important was that trade finance of German imports and export was made via the city of London. And with the introduction of capital controls, these merchant and clearing banks, they were sitting on these bills and could not exchange them anymore. So the whole London, the money market of London, of the London city, was dried out, and then these banks went to the Bank of England and brought these bills. These were high quality bills, and withdrew foreign exchange or gold, and so that was a weakening.
Mm.
That was maybe the main trigger, but on the other hand, Great Britain was in a very difficult situation. It was the debt was still very high, from stemming from the war. There was a high unemployment, political polarization, and in the end, there was a strike by Navy soldiers who were strongly affected by the cutting of wages, which was necessary because, again, the United Kingdom had to defend the gold standard. In order to defend it, it had to have a balanced budget. That
Mm-hmm.
led to these austerity measures. It also had the debt, it had to service its debt. So Great Britain was already in a difficult economic situation. And with the German crisis, the whole financial system or these financial flows stopped to run smoothly, and that led to a drastic reduction of the gold reserves and foreign exchange reserves, but especially the gold reserves of the Bank of England. And then there was a final attack, and that was it. And the international investors at that time, they became very suspicious of the United States because you had basically the same situation: difficult economic situation, recession, a series of banking crises. The United States didn't have the problem that they had to pay back any foreign or domestic debt, so they had more room of maneuver, but still they were in a difficult situation. And also the international investors believed that when the first pillar of the international monetary system, the British pound, collapses, then it's just a matter of time until the second pillar will collapse, the US dollar. And so, and again, it was this self-fulfilling prophecy. There was a run on the dollar. You see how the gold reserves of the Federal Reserve System drastically are being reduced after the fall of the British pound. And then the Fed um, decides to raise interest rates, which was required under the rules of the gold standard. When a central bank loses gold, it has to kind of reattract or reverse the flow of gold to make it attractive to bring it back and to
Mm-hmm.
buy US securities, because there you have some income. Gold doesn't produce any income.
Mm-hmm.
And that actually worked. You see that these gold outflows stop, and gold comes back. So they can restore the confidence of the US dollar. But the price was enormous. This interest rate hike really crushed the economy, and there was another series of banking crises. I mean, just remember, I think nominal interest rates were raised around 5%, but deflation was about 5% minus per year. So you had kind of real interest rates of 10%. It's unimaginable today
Mm-hmm.
how this interest rate shock reinforced the downturn of the American economy, and how it weakened the banking sector. But I mean, the international investors were wrong in a sense. by attacking the US dollar, but we can understand why they did it. I mean, they were just really afraid of being late again after the collapse of the British pound. That's why this year is so interesting, also from a psychological or a social or a political perspective. It was really the collapse of confidence in the existing system.
So I wanted to switch to the political side in Germany. So, and you had mentioned it, but how did all of this stuff happening economically lead to Hitler's rise?
Yeah, I mean, there is no direct line. I think try to make it very clear. It's just it contributed to the collapse of the Weimar
Mm-hmm.
Republic, and of course there were many other reasons why the Weimar Republic was never very stable. And I mean, comparing with the United States, the comparison clearly shows that stable democracy like the US was able to survive such a disastrous economic crisis without collapsing politically. Although it
Mm-hmm.
was also really not close, but I think the later part of 1932 was really critical. Um, so that I would never say that this was the crucial
Mm-hmm.
factor. But my
Okay.
point was to say that it was not just a normal recession. It was a absolutely singularly devastating financial crisis that weakened the Weimar Republic. And most people are not aware of that. They just think, well, the recession started, there were more and more unemployed people, and eventually that helped Hitler. But it was much more. It was first the recession, then this financial crisis, a complete collapse of confidence in the economic management of the Weimar Republic or of the existing Brüning cabinet. So
Mm-hmm.
it was like a river that flows downward, but all of a sudden, how do you call it? The water really, it's a waterfall then,
Yeah.
and you really lose a lot of security. And I think that was really important. That, combined with what I already mentioned, for the opposition, it was like a gift to be able to to blame the government for giving priority to foreign creditors, foreign investors over the needs of the unemployed and the poor and the domestic the economic situation. I think these two factors have been underestimated by many political historians. For them, it's more a political story combined with the recession, but they leave aside the devastating impact of this financial crisis. That's I also tried to remind people of that, but actually, to be honest, it hasn't helped a lot. I just read another book which has been sold very well about the end of the Weimar Republic, and it's not that the author has not understood the importance of this very specific economic uh, evolution during the early
Mm-hmm.
1930s. So that's okay. I mean,
Wow.
that's the way it is. But I mean, that's why I wrote the book, to remind people it's more than just a recession.
Yeah.
And of course, we know the other factors are like the elites, the bureaucratic elites. Many of them did never believe in the Weimar Republic. They were still dreaming of some old authoritarian regime. Then, of course, you had very strong right wing movements, not just within the party scene, but also within the army. They wanted to take back the lost territories. This was revanchist agenda was very well accepted by many people, and so on. I mean, there are a lot of reasons that I would never ignore or consider minor, but I think the political historians need learn more about the economic situation.
So let's move to today. And I know you're careful about making parallels between that time and now. But if any, what do you see as similar scenarios to what was happening economically then?
Well, the very specific parallel is what I observed during the Euro crisis, where we
Mm-hmm.
already talked about that.
Yep.
And that can repeat itself because not just in Europe, but with any country, maybe emerging market, uh, which has a high share of foreign debt denominated in foreign currencies, uh, can be, can find itself in such a situation during a recession. Luckily, emerging markets have learned in the last couple of decades to, to reduce their dependence on foreign capital. But when you go back to the 1980s, we had a very terrible debt crisis in Latin America that had the same structure. In the late 1990s, the Asian crisis was more about the debt of private companies, but it was also foreign debt denominated in mostly in US dollars. And that was a real debt trap during when the economy turned. We have individual cases like Argentina. Turkey is in a critical situation. So in a way, what happened to Weimar Germany is exactly the same what has happened to a series of emerging markets over and over again since, I would say, the 1970s, 1980s. For instance, the collapse of Eastern Europe was also um, uh, partly a consequence of a foreign debt crisis. Poland was more or less bankrupt in the late 1980s, or Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was in a terrible debt situation the late 80s, early 90s, and the struggle over the fiscal burden was one of the reasons why Croatia and Slovenia then left Yugoslavia. So we that's a real economic structure that is dangerous, uh, or economic dependency that is very dangerous in recessions. And the other one, I would say, it's a more general one, and it's we've been discussing this a lot in Europe, but I think it's a global issue. Is how you balance international agreements and sovereignty. That's a very,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's very difficult, and you have to renegotiate this all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But it's dangerous when a country thinks it has lost its sovereignty. And today, I would say, for example, in Europe, it's also about democracy. I mean, if you vote, but you realize, or you take a vote and you realize you cannot implement the decision because you're bound by international agreements. But on the other hand, you, the people in the country think it's an important issue to have a decision domestically, then you can have really great frictions. And I think that's also a bit the lessons from the interwar years. They had this international order that tried to reestablish peace. I think they had very good intentions, and I think they always tried to readjust it, as I said in the beginning. So it was not a, it was a, the Young Plan had some really, uh, yeah, it had some real improvements towards Germany, but in the end, it was not sustainable because it could not be balanced with German domestic politics or American domestic politics in a sense, because uh, yeah, the willingness to reduce debt claims towards Europe was not there, so it just didn't work. And I think that's an important second parallel, and we should really be very careful that we're not uh, yeah, accelerating globalization institutionally too quickly, because then you're going to lose a lot of countries, and you cause a lot of friction in countries, and you're going to see a backlash against any kind of globalization. So you have to be very careful. And sometimes I have the feeling, especially in Europe, some politicians are not careful enough, and that's why in the moment we have a real backlash from anti-immigration parties, and immigration is a classical central issue of globalization. And I think the lesson from history is that you always have to be very careful. You could never, if you want to have immigration, you have to control it. Otherwise, people starting to yeah to yeah like yeah you you lose confidence that the government is really taking care of the people who are here relative
Yeah.
to the people who are coming. I mean, and I'm absolutely for immigration as a Swiss. I mean, we have profited enormously for centuries, I have to say. But on the other hand, you have to be careful that that you just think, yes, you can, it's not worth discussing because it's a good thing as such. No, you have to be right in the details, and you have to revise all the time your immigration regime a little bit. And I think it's maybe far fetched, but I think it's you can read the interwar years in that sense, that this balance between international agreements and domestic politics, democracy. And I think the statesmen or politicians have to be very careful about that.
Mm. Now, I think probably one final question. So you wrote your book in 2019, and we had the whole COVID thing since then, basically a year after your book came out, for 4 years or so. And I think we're still feeling that, which kind of, from a debt perspective, looks like a war. Do you think that's fair to say? I mean, the amount of spending around that is crazy. So debt seems very high around the world. In the U.S., our national debt's incredibly high. I've read China's is really high. Japan. Since you wrote your book, is there anything debt-wise you're looking at that reminds you of 1931?
Not directly, because there is really a big difference between domestic debt and
Mm-hmm.
foreign debt, and it's there. I'm really careful to draw any parallels. Um, I have an opinion on this debt, of course, this COVID debt, but it's not the same kind of crisis.
Yeah.
I think foreign domestic debt is easier to have for a certain amount of time, and you have more possibilities to avoid a sudden crisis. Whereas foreign debt, you whenever the economy turns, you're really in a very you're in a straitjacket. Um, and I think the case against domestic debt is that in a crisis, you have less possibilities to fight the crisis once the debt is too high. I remember Italy uh,
Mm-hmm.
it just doesn't have the fiscal freedom to fight a crisis when it's necessary. And I think that's the most dangerous one. In the short run, nothing is going to happen, but you have to spend more and more on servicing your debt. You have to curtail really important um, investments. For example, in Germany, they have a very strict debt brake, so they have really neglected their public investments. These kind of things, but those are rather slow, long-term processes, but have enormously negative consequences. That makes it, in a way, even more dangerous because you don't realize it how dependent you are uh, on what the politicians in previous generations did, or what we ourselves have decided. You really have to. All of a sudden, you realize, oh, we don't have any money for education or investment or
Right.
whatever infrastructure, and that worries me. In the short term, I'm not worried. I mean, there is still some, but the trend is not a good one.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think, I mean, if you owe debts in a currency you can't print, you're really stuck if you can't pay
Exactly.
it off. If you owe debts in your own currency, which you can print, you're not necessarily heading for the 1931
Exactly.
Weimar collapse, but it basically gets passed down all to your own citizens, it feels like, because there needs to be some sort of debasement to fund that debt, which is your dollar being worth much less than it was before. And I think we're going through that in the US,
Mhm.
probably Europe as well right now. So definitely different, but the amount of debt seems dangerous, I guess, in a different way. That would be
Yeah, yeah, but
what it looks like to me.
what worries me a little is that is the trend. You know that there's no. I
Hmm.
mean, you if you want to spend more, it's okay, but then you have to raise tax, but you cannot spend
Right,
more all the time and never talk about income.
right.
But that's you in a way. That's the mood right now in Europe and also in China, as you said correctly.
Yeah,
I mean, China is not in a better situation. They have now with their uh, housing crisis.
yeah,
That's also fiscally very dangerous.
seems that way. Are you working on any new books or
Yeah,
projects or studying different time periods?
yeah. I just finished the book which is written in a similar way about German reparations after World War II. So that was a very radical solution. They just more or less deleted all reparations, and I
Mm,
try to explain how they decided. And it's hope it's also an entertaining book that explains the mechanism of post-war reconstruction in Europe.
mm.
And
Wow.
it's tough because the people or the countries who had most suffered from Nazi Germany, and there was no question about who was the villain. I mean, after World War II, you could argue there were several
Hmm.
countries involved but I mean, it was so. But exactly in that situation, the Western Allies then decide, no, we cannot afford another round of reparation regime that doesn't work. That's
Mm,
fascinating to see how they try to learn from history, but it was not a really fair deal, you know. And I think winning the peace is extremely difficult because you have to exclude certain groups um, which absolutely have legitimate claims, but
mm,
you need to have a priority, and that can be very brutal and contradicts all conventional wisdom about justice. And that makes it really painful also to see it. But in the end, it was a successful agreement, but still try to describe both sides
mm.
of this story.
Is that book out and available for sale in English? I didn't see it on
Yes,
your
it's
Amazon
written in
page.
English, but it's got to be
Okay.
it's in the process of being prepared, and it
Okay.
should be published next year. Yes,
Okay, great.
beginning of next year. But I've read it's there. It's a couple of months.
I well, I encourage everyone to read 1931. I'm going to link to your book and to your website if anyone wanted to read more of your work. Is there anyone else anywhere else on the internet you'd want me to send people to learn more
No,
about you?
thank you very much. No, that's very kind of you.
Okay. Well, Tobias, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with me today. It was fascinating.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the interesting conversation. Bye.